Τέτοια έξοδο που έχει σίγουρα, σωστά.
Να μ' ανέβεις το ποντίκι.
Ναι, όταν είναι χθες αυτό.
Τι είναι.
Πάμε κάπως το πήρα.
Απλά εδώ πέρα, άμα είναι το δικό μας...
Όχι, θα είναι το δικό του μήνυμα.
Εντάξει. Θα μιλάει γενικά από το παιδί σου εδώ, γιατί...
situation because only one of the speakers in this morning's panel is present. This is Mr. Laurentiu Beldeam, he's in the Department of Music at Transylvanian University in Brașov, Romania. The title of his talk is Levels of Multimedia Rhetoric in the Polytop de Persepolis, 1971. Defining cyber world categories through some registers of philosophy and scientific aesthetics.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your coming, and thank you very much for your invitation. My speech focuses on defining the cyber rhetoric which envelops the Polytop de Persepolis. Then, it suggests some hints to the total semantic field register, according to Henri Lefebvre, which favors the activation of several levels of lecture oriented toward the media realm. The first point I'd like to make is that Xenakis is a pathbreaker in musical thinking, a revolutionary, if you want. In order to understand this, we have to take into account that his background wasn't designed as by a traditional composer. He was trained as engineer and as architect. He worked with Le Corbusier in terms of architecture, and these things informed his music. He was multi-educated, he was educated on many layers. His background is thus important. I have just asserted that engineering and architecture informs music. The abundance of his sensory perception defined his unique route in musical composition. This is what Klaus Stefan Mankoff's argumentation is, and I agree with. I quote, "One should also not define Xenakis up to a composer of traditional making in the other way. In a strict sense, he does not compose, and this makes him a composer." Quotation ended. This sounds like a contradiction in terms. He does not compose. Yes, somebody who does not compose is not a composer. But Mankoff continues, but this makes him a composer. In fact, Xenakis is an anti-composer because he's against his opposite of being a composer. Let's continue with Mankoff's second statement. Composing is an idea completely foreign to Xenakis. His scores are overflowing with passages that no musician who grew up in the Central European tradition has ever been responsible for. These are sometimes simply stupid and musical in the most banal sense of the word. We have to explore further this idea. In order to understand Mankoff's argument, we need to briefly consider the Central European tradition, I mean the tradition in composition. This tradition is based on Auskomponierung technique, or unfolding in English. For centuries in the music history, Auskomponierung produced an enormous variety of compositions, fugues, sonatas, motets. Auskomponierung is a set of techniques, a box. It is like a toolbox. The toolbox has in it what you needed, what you learned in a school of composition, what a composer can do using a prescribed technique. But it was somebody who emptied this toolbox because he had another one, and this is Xenakis. He did not compose in Auskomponierung. That means he is not a composer. his toolbox is different. Xenakis' toolbox makes him to be an anti-composer. Anti means the opposing to composing. In this light, it is not surprising that Xenakis considered Auskomponierung as an instrument of torture. In short, what is precisely Auskomponierung? Auskomponierung is a compositional working system designed in the way of crocheting musical structures as by using a needle. Thus, the tone distances can be drawn as close steps in a gradual motion or as skipping tones. The Auskomponierung structured the mental frame of composers in the whole historical evolution of music. Using Auskomponierung, these composers were the full consumers of the classical rhetoric. They used different methods of construction, shaping different forms of expression. Sonatas, fugues, yes, you know this stuff. Forgetting my point, you might take into consideration Cicero, one of the mentors of classical rhetoric. His display of persuasion developed a specific paradigm. A closed space, a chapel, or a public space. A strict conformation to the limits of the place in the act of persuasion. An oratorial style which shaped the emotional agreement between the oratorio, and a unique toolbox used for persuasion. Keeping these points in mind, we are coming closer to Xenakis and his multimedia rhetoric, considering the polytope de Persepolis. Now that we understood the rhetoric amplifications and the composition viewed as Auskomponierung, that everybody did it, that everybody still does it. I don't know why in 21st century composers are composing symphonies. I don't know why, but composed. We will see that Xenakis is the exception. The core of my argument is that the opponent of the classical rhetoric toolbox, he had to define a new rhetoric model, and this is the cyber rhetoric. In the Polytope de Persepolis, Xenakis contrasts the two rhetorics. I have established in the Polytope de Persepolis some reading levels which will be defined step by step further. Metaphysics here has to be understood as suggested in his modality of thinking by Derrida. I will return to the meaning of this concept a bit later. However, on this level of explanation, it has to be understood as the whole spectrum of ideas in philosophy in the history of culture. For example, the law of causality, the entire succession of experiences lasting from ages which shaped the education of the human being. Metaphysics is a canonizing way which oriented the man only toward one aim on one direction. Religion can be viewed as such. It is a metaphysical program, so to say. I connected here the statements of metaphysics with those of the classical rhetoric and with the Auskomponierung. The cyber rhetoric in Persepolis is meant to take away the huge amount of thinking habits acquired through the tools of metaphysics. Now, only some words about the Polytope de Persepolis. Dedicated to the art festival in Shiraz, Iran, the Polytope de Persepolis vibrates as a message of solidarity between cultures and nations, asserting that a depoliticized culture will be capable to always open to people the possibility of opposing options. This polytope regulates the encounter of Homo historicus with Homo algorithmicus at the ruins of the temple built by Darius III. Here on slide, you can distinguish the two categories of the rhetorical figures put in contrast: the classical figures on the left and the cyber-rhetoric figures present in Persepolis production on the right. If the classical rhetoric figures served as instruments of persuasion for a canonized space, the cyber-rhetoric figures challenges an unlimited space, enhancing the medium of persuasion up to a tsunami sound. Moving right along, we can formalize the display of the polytope as follows. In the piece Diamorphosis, composed between 1957 and 1958, as in Polytope de Persepolis, designed to successively cohabitate in the nighttime production of the Shiraz Festival from 1971, Xenakis once again experimented the mix of pure electronic sounds with concrete sounds and, additionally, as John Rand asserted, the invasion of the visual into the musical. On this slide, I want to express 2 points. The first one refers to the material which develops the narrative trajectory in the polytope, and here I can stress the transgressive power of glissandos. Because of its constant shifting, the glissando destabilizes the listener's perception of an harmonic grounding. And the second one insists of profiling the psychological element which is very present in the polytope. The composer's portrait is expressing permanent its voice. This brings us to the perception of a their body, which finds its signification in Xenakis' world experience. It is about a psychological dislocation caused by a conscience that sits on the single eye. I have looked to the polytope de Persepolis as to a honeycomb of time in the wirenet of the observe how is working the abundance of sensory perception due to the deconstruction of Auskomponierung, but also the manner to approach echoes of the past differently. In the body of my analysis, I integrated some registers of the post-structuralist philosophy which are connected with Xenakis' intermodal thinking. Jacques Lacan and Jacques Derrida's ideas delivered me the conceptual background. The encounter with the deconstruction theory and with the theory of the split object spatialized my approaches. In addition to the way of understanding illustrated in terms of deconstruction theory by Derrida, the theory of the split object I absorbed through the analysis method developed by Lacan enabled me to think at Persepolis in relation with Xenakis' biography. Xenakis' psychological dislocation caused due to his war experience when his eye was extremely wounded in Athens in 1945 came out in Persepolis' display as a continuous expression of anxiety. This condition, remembering him about his very risky situation, about his leaving the presence of a their eye, or more precisely, of a their body, changed drastically his form of perception, lying back against into chaos, as Lacan would say. I tried to flexibilize the meaning of the 4 concepts coined by Derrida. Difference, produces an inversion of metaphysical concepts. Difference is related to memory, to the program and the history of life, and it enables the unpredictable interactivity of technogenesis with all its prolongations to be redoubled along with the design of anthropogenesis, in this way letting to enhance our sensory perception. The exteriorization of memory, twins of technology, constitutes a new memory, different in comparison to archive memory. And this feature gives structural articulation of the anti-realist reading process and a color of indecision. The deconstruction thinking, I mean to read outside a writing signature, reorganizes the differences and is thus described by the concept difference, which should be understood as the origin without origin of the play of the difference. Opening of the first exteriority in general, surrounding the idea of the enigmatic relationship of the living to its other and of an inside to the outside. Living to its other meant for me, focusing on Persepolis, that the teleological narrative is liquidated, the metaphysics is less present, and with its change to genetics, this new one evolves just for living in the cyberspace. Let's continue with the supplement spaces. This concept helped me to think further in terms of construction, approaching the synergy-enhanced techno-diversity in the ritual. The supplement in Persepolis sets up the experience related to the diversities of writings, which cannot be reduced to each other. The supplement deconstructs the writing. Finally, we come to the end with Chora. The term Chora had been used in philosophy by Plato in Timaeus' dialogue to designate a space, a material substratum, or an interval. In Plato's concept, Chora is described as a formless interval, similar to not being. Here, on this territory, the forms are received from the intelligible realm, where they are originally held, and are copied, are shaped into the transitory forms of the sensible realm. Thus, this territory gives space, generates a matrix. Derrida re-articulates Chora to name a radical otherness that gives space for being. He uses a deconstruction approach to investigate Plato's word usage. Derrida's aim with Chora's text is to deregionalize, to destabilize the ontology. That is, how the Chora instrumentalizes and shows the deregionalization. Persepolis follows some structural rules, regulates its cyber rhetoric, which orchestrates the effect of chronological misplacing, and the deregionalization, the feeling of being out of place. Xenakis' music is a projection, and his polytopes as well. He took into account the dimensions of a space of an architectural object whilst he formulated a plan for his syncretic composition. His idea was, I think, that the human being is a projection. He had an awareness starting to look at things from a level which is n-dimensional, and then to go slowly down just for making us possible to see what we only can see, a three-dimensional space. He designed for this demonstration a translation of the whole Persepolis performance from a multidimensional geometry into a 3D geometry, the only geometry from where for present the human being can perceive the world. If, for instance, you take an object from a multidimensional geometry and project it into another geometry with a lower degree in dimensions, it will acquire a different shape, a distorted one. So that in the fourth dimension, everything will appear distorted, complicated for us. We will then talk about the spirit of that dimension. The mathematicians of projective geometries as Lobachevsky, Beaulieu, Riemann, Sophus Lie, and Felix Klein conceived just that, and so did Xenakis. They generalized geometry on a high scale because they wanted to transport its dimensions to infinity, starting from Euclidean geometry. And now I am coming to my conclusions. Rejecting conventional wisdom in terms of composition, Xenakis denied oppressive paradigm of writing as suggested by Derrida, stepped outside the box of older models in conceiving music, rebelled toward the subordination of metaphysical categories, rejected traditional Auskomponierung. The new roadmap featured in Polytope de Persepolis explores new meaning possibilities, engaging categories or levels of space, or, so to say, a cyber rhetoric in which the mixed media network leaves the trace, the metaphysics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank Dr. Belder. And now we can take questions. Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. It was very thought-inducing. I have to say that I have problems with the term Auskomponierung, and I wonder who is actually stupid, Klaus Stefan Mahnkopf or Xenakis. And so I think there might be a misunderstanding of what linear counterpoint actually means. I am aware of this article in the Gravesana Blätter in which Xenakis makes a reference to the composition technique that was popular at the time, which consisted of, rows, tone rows, which were jumped over large intervals, had large leaps, and he was referring to a perceptual category by, basically stating that you cannot hear these rows, how they move from one note to the other, but you should rather approach this kind of style from a statistical perspective, where you have a more or less statistical distribution of certain notes to sound. And so in other words, what he's applying is a perceptual category to a composition strategy or approach, which in his eyes didn't fulfill its promises. So if anything, when we're talking about Auskomponierung is also, of course, a reference to Adorno, who in his article über einige Schwierigkeiten des Komponierens heute described the fact that the mathematical approach that composers in the 1960s or late 1950s were taking, that this approach didn't go through this subject, and that it also then led to something dead, And I think we were all aware of the fact that this cannot be applied to Xenakis, even his early 1950s pieces are dead. So
yes, you are perfectly right.
Because because of the fact that he is applying a perceptual category to his compositions and an awareness of perception. As auskomponieren.
You mean Xenakis approach?
Xenakis, yes.
Actually, this term was coined by Heinrich Schenker, and actually it took into account the whole amount of genres which took this type of technique of set of tool or toolbox, as I told you, of going and taking in account the intervals between tones. Yes, and this is a very arithmetical approach. Has nothing to do with the statistics. Actually, is about levels of mathematics you are approaching with. For example, pitch class stats theory, yes, which is also offered to Auskomponierung technique. Yes, it's using this trivial mathematics, so to say, yes, counting the tones and in Ryan technique, the distances between intervals, yes. This was, for example, a bit banal, I think. And if you are talking about stochastic distributions as another layers of mathematics, these combinations between tones, this type of Mengenlehre sozusagen, or sets theory, comes a bit redundant for Xenakis. And I think the approach of Mankov, it's due to this orientation, this different orientation, this bifurcation he wanted to emphasize between Auskomponierung as museal technique, yes, which is also learned today in academies, and the Xenakis very radical approach to technique in itself.
Once again, I'm not sure. First of all, Mankov's statements doesn't take Xenakis' development into consideration from someone who's started off as someone being in the discourse of linear counterpoint, stereo techniques, sets of theory,
yes,
and arrives somewhere totally different, at the end of his life, And I find he is actually moving from something, more mathematical to something which does represent the term auskomponieren. I think he becomes a composer that really does auskomponieren. And I think, I don't know what Mankov is referring to. I'm not sure what piece he's referring to. There was no indication.
He refers to the technique in itself.
Yeah,
yes?
Right. But which technique, actually?
For example, stochastic distribution and clouds of sounds. They have nothing to do with counting tones from one to another, as by using a needle, yes? Every composer starts to compose a theme with variation, starting from one tone, and then he thinks, yes, perfect quints. Then comes a major third, and then comes a second, an octave. And this is a very, very regular and predictable type of calculation. And this for Xenakis was not. This is for him an instrument of torture. This type of polyphony, or bringing the tones in this manner on the paper.
Okay. Once again, I believe that we should also take the lifetime of a composer into consideration, not just look at certain statements which were made at a given time. We will, and that's I guess something that I just wanted to make this modest contribution.
Yes.
But thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you
very much. Thank you very much.
We have other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation, provocative, meaning stimulating for me, for us, I think. There are a lot of ideas. I would like to express a personal view on this. about Auskomponierung, I think it's true for the young Xenakis. It's less true for the late Xenakis, for last Xenakis. My feeling is that Xenakis, in a way, discovered by himself, who reinvented by himself a kind of Auskomponierung, even Durchkomponierung. What we heard a day before yesterday, Ikor, string trio, Ikor, for me it's also a kind of Auskomponierung. In a new way, in a new deturned way. Second thing, I retained the word nostalgia about the past.
Yes.
For me, it's not nostalgia, but some kind of intemporality. It's the intemporality of geometry, of mathematics. It's a kind of unity between past and our epoch. It's little place for nostalgia, I think. It's kind of very, very unifying. And third element, we will discuss after about Cora, the Platonic
term.
No, I don't want to develop here, but so the intermediary space between on one side what is this archetype, abstract, and ideal, and realization of the archetype.
But it's
concrete.
reformulated by Derrida. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. I would like to start with the middle question. Actually, when I talked about projective space, which was designed in Xenakis' mind, he put in consideration also this historical approach. Also, it's a medial realm which is not very, artificial in terms of geometry, but it includes levels of lecture. This projection, it's not only a formalization model as in geometries, hyperbolic geometry or something like this, but it's put also the nostalgia there, the history, the traces. Actually, he wanted to project his own history of life, his experience of life, into the whole context of coast life. This is Persepolis, and these are the reasons he took these polytopes as space for projecting his own geometry into the coast geometry. Mycene Alpha or Persepolis are such examples. And this nostalgia, this is actually a level in this projective of the human thinking in his first he had very
I was very impressed by your reference. I'm a painter, and my father, Anastas Logothetis, was exactly on that point, very much of the same opinion as Xenakis, and therefore that was not only a notational problem, but it was a problem of preciseness on the basis of mathematical categories, which is at the same time algorithm, numbers, methods, and having to do with space, with analytic geometry, and and he created new notation on analyzing exactly in this field using artistic methods which come from graphics, which means science developed in order to communicate. So what I want to say as a visual artist, that I know there is, I always forget the name, a sculptor who tried to put into a sculpture, to make a sculpture from a mathematical Gleichung, how is it called? Equation. And what happened, the equation was very simple, and the product is much more complex, and it didn't really finish. So it doesn't come together. The form is a sort of not correlates to a very simple symbol. It doesn't function. So if you have a branch and you want to put those lines into a mathematical form, the form will be very, very long. It doesn't correlate. So the form can be very plump for a very long mathematical equation. The thing is, what I always am so astonished about is if you take any sort of measure of a sheet, mathematically, you have the universe there because you have an infinite possibilities and points. So in space, there's incorporated our definition of infinity. So what is preciseness for an artist? Has to do with Gestalt. What is Gestalt?
Configuration.
Configuration. So Gestalt is Gestalt. So the preciseness of an artist cannot be expressed by numbers. So this is in the subject of composition. It's inside. So you have to come to Gestalt in order to be precise.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's all, yes? Thank you very much.
Yes, there is another question there. Thank you. Oh, excuse me a second.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
This is the problem of perception. And that's why it's so, the modernity, it came to me that the modernity is materialistic because after the philosophy of metaphysics stopped, so everything has to be explored and defined in a new way, and that's the modernism, which was.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker, please.
I was just wondering if Xenakis knew of the quaternion equation of Sir William Rowan Hamilton, who invented the quaternion in 1843 in Dublin, which gave the fourth dimension to space. And it was that equation, I squared is equal to j squared is equal to k squared is equal to ijk equals -1, is what landed the lunar module on the moon with NASA, and also has big applications to computer games. And so here is an example of an equation that actually had practical implications 150 years after its.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
So I am very curious.
Yes, actually, I am not mathematician. I'm not, thank you very much for the question. I'm not mathematician, but I think the overlapping of geometries, hyperbolic geometries, spherical geometries, influenced Xenakis very much. People are talking mostly about indeterminacy and stochastic music, but I think also the geometrical points of view influenced Xenakis very much. These projections of geometrical shapes and also this topological accommodation was very important to Xenakis, not only this stochastic distribution and clouds and statistical approach to calculation. I think he was a many-layered thinker in these terms of mathematics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stop here, and there is a half an hour break, and then the next panel starts at 11:30. I thank again Dr. Verden for a very stimulating talk.
that you might already be familiar with, and maybe some you will learn some other elements. And in the second part, I will present how we were able to recover the data and analyze it. So I'm going to take an example of a methodology to try and explain how I did proceed to recollect the missing parts. So the polytope de Cluny took place in between 72 and 74. There were two versions. So the version I'm going to talk about is the second version, where there are some improvements on the laser devices. So the sound diffusion in the polytope is made by 12 loudspeakers, arranged as there seems to be a Larsen going on. Arranged as 2 layers of 6 speakers. And some music was dynamically routed on this sound system. I'm going to talk about this later. There were also 600 flashes that were organized on 6 layers on the ceiling. They looked from the ground as a orthogonal grid. And so since you had to wait 2 seconds to be able to retrigger the flash. So this explains a lot of the grammar that Xenakis had to devise to be able to use them. Then there were also the lasers, which were a brand new technology at the time. It had been used mostly in labs, but Xenakis was among the first people to use it for artistical purpose. So there are 3 lasers in total. What you see highlighted there on the photograph is the laser source itself, which was just a beam, and there was nothing at all that allowed to use the beam for artistic purposes. So Xenakis had to work with engineers to create something that made it possible to make figures and all kinds of effects. So there was what he called a tourelle, or turret in English, which is basically a box with mirrors in it that were able to make an initial deflection of the trajectory of the laser and send it towards other optical equipment. So you can see a bit better the turret on the right-hand side picture. So those optical equipments, there are several categories of them. So the first one that you will see on many photographs are created by a network of 300 mirrors. So those were fixed and very hard and time-consuming to set, because you had to set each one by one. And they made it possible to create about 12 or 13 figures per laser. So, for example, you see highlighted the lines, so it's an incomplete figure because the photograph is not very great, but you see a bit of an example of what it can do. And, or in the previous photograph on the right, you can see also some kinds of effects. Then there were also some, what Xenakis called omega mirrors. Basically, it was a mirror mounted on two motors that allowed to move the laser in the 2 directions quite slowly. So you had a moving beam across the room, and what you see is that on the wall it created a point moving. So with long take photographs as this one, it creates this zigzaggy form. And finally, you had deflectors. So those created some volumetric shapes. Basically, it's a mirror fixed on 2 vibrators. So they vibrate along 2 different frequencies on each axis and create a conical shape. So you see on the right the deflector on the deflector itself. And when projected on the wall, it created this lissajou pattern. If you know them. For example, you have an example here. And it was also possible to move them across the space. And finally, maybe you noticed this big scaffolding, so it was used to set everything up, but it had to be left during the show. And finally, you have the control cabin, where all the equipment that controlled all this apparatus was hosted. There was some glass panels so that everyone could see the very impressive tech stuff that was inside, because at the time it was unseen before. So let's go inside and see how everything is managed and controlled. So this is a view from the cabin itself. There are a number of devices here. I'm going to explain a bit what each of them does. So on the left you have what took care of the audio part of the Polito Bikini. So on the forefront you have a Ampex LM1000 tape reader. So it reads an 8-track tape. On this 8-track tape we have 7 tracks of audio, and 1 track was left for synchronization purposes. Excuse me. So there are a bit of sometimes you read that that the data for the control was stored on this track, which is not true. It was just for sync purposes. But in fact, it was left blank because I'll explain why, but it was unused. So there was, as I said, 12 loudspeakers, but only 7 tracks. So you guess that you have to do some routing of the sound, and this was done dynamically. So if it's done dynamically, whether to have someone do it, or you can automate this. So this was the solution that was chosen. In order to do that, you have to devise some kind of digital control. So the control was done by interpreting another tape. So there were 2 tapes actually, one for audio and one for control. This tape is digital, meaning it's only 1s and 0s. And it was stored on a 9-track tape, so I'm not going to go into details, but it's a very weird format from IBM at the time. Basically, it's 8 tracks that store bytes, and 1 track for redundancy and error checking, which was unused for the Polito Bikini. So you have on one hand an 8-track tape with only 7 used, and on the other hand a 9-track tape with only 8 used. It's a bit confusing. Data on this tape was used to control flashes, lasers, and sound diffusion. So it was organized as what I call frames of data, which is basically a block of 150 bytes that were to be interpreted to control everything. So in this 24 times per second. So every 24th of a second you had a complete refresh of the whole show. The data was fed into this huge metal thing, which is basically some control circuitry that was put together especially for the show. It's you could call this kind of an purposely made monotasking computer. So it was supposed to do the data formatting to send towards the various equipments, and also to create the high voltage relays, in particular for the flashes that were controlled with 240 volts that of course you couldn't get from the tape. So this is why it is so big. It's because it's full of switches that are about this size. So I talked about synchronization earlier. The idea was, of course, you had to run 2 separate devices at the same time. So when it's taped, you might get some speed drifting. So you might not have some synchronization between the sound and the specialization of the sound, and also the light. So what was thought at the time was to spare the 8th track of the audio tape to store a pulse at 24 pulses per second. That would trigger the reading of the digital tape. But for many reasons it wasn't done, and instead, since the tape reader was already packed with information, it couldn't handle more than that. It didn't have any time to stop and restart, so they just press play at the beginning and cross fingers that it wouldn't drift too much, which happened. I talked with some guy who worked on that, and he told me that sometimes the sound finished before the lights were able, which was not intended, of course. So yes, this system was never implemented. So this is a recap of the whole command chain that I just described. So you see that really the digital tape handles everything from the optical devices, and also does the dynamic routing of the sound, which comes from the other tape reader. So the really missing part for the polytope, in order to be able one day to imagine its reconstruction, was the data tape, because we have the sound tape at Salabed, so we have the 8-track master, but we were missing the data tape. Fortunately, it was located in the archives at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and it was digitized on specific equipment, but it wasn't easy to do. Some stuff from the BNF did that. And so we got a digital version of this tape, and hopefully we can try and make it so that it doesn't disappear again. Of course, the tape was in pretty rough shape because it was the tape used for the actual show. So, but fortunately, there is not too much reading errors, and we can correct them with quite good certainty. So now I'm going to explain a bit what's on this tape and show you how it was done at the time. So when you take a frame of data that is a 150 bytes block, which runs a 24th of a second of the show, this is what you see. This is a graphical representation, of course, so you have the 8 tracks stacked together and you read from left to right. So on the left you have the flash triggers. It's very straightforward. You have 600 bits and 600 flashes. So A1 in some it triggers 1 flash. So for example, this is a reconstitution of on the right you have a simulation of a few frames, and this matches one drawing by Xenakis in the archives. On the right you have the audio routing, so I'm not going to go into details there, but it tells you have seven different blocks, each corresponding to 1 track, and the data basically says where to output, on which speaker to output, at what level. So we also have the audio routing. These are the deflector frequency banks. So again, there are 3 of them, and you have 2 directions, so 6 banks in total. This little part was unused, and this is the most interesting and intricate part, is the laser control. So if we take, let's take the first magenta part of laser control and write it as a stream of bits instead of this graphical representation. So this is what we can work out, what each bit does. So the X's are just unused. You have the turret configuration number, so basically you send this number to the turret to choose which optical equipment to play with. Then there is just a set configuration bit. And then you have 4 bits that handle the deflector movements and 4 that handle the omega mirror movements. And there is some left 1 bit that I don't really know what it is. What's interesting, however, about this turret configuration number is that As you can see, it's 4 bits, so it's values between 0 and 15. But the problem is that we don't have a clue of it's undocumented. We don't know what number corresponds to what configuration, what optical device. So this is where it's really getting a bit interesting and a bit nerdy, but I hope you follow. We have to guess by cross-referencing several documents to try and guess what number corresponds to what optical device. So what we want to do is fill this table. So you have 1, 2, and 3 are the lasers, and for its configuration, we want to write in the appropriate cell what is the optical device or laser figure, etc. So first off, we can just examine the closer look at the tape itself, at the data on the tape. And we can see that some configurations are never used, so we can discard them. Some are used when there is some omega mirror movement, so we can guess it selects the omega mirror. And we'll also have the same for the deflectors. So already this gives us a little bit of information. What we have left now is to try and guess all the figures. So you know the figures that use the networks of mirrors. I said there were about 12 to 13 per laser. We have to guess that now. So first step is to look at the figures themselves, because they can tell us a lot about how Xenakis intended to use them. If you look on those ones, let's take, for example, arc for laser 1. So this is the green figure in the middle. You see that the 3 stacked figures look quite similar to each other. And if you cycle through them rapidly, it happens to create kind of a kinetic motion. So it seems obvious that, of course, you could use just one of them and have it stay on for 1 minute. It could also work, but it would make some sense that Xenakis intended to use them as cycles, rapidly cycling patterns. So we know we can try and look for patterns on the tape, and this can correlate to this kind of figures. And also you see that, for example, in arc again, between laser 1 and laser 2, there is some kind of symmetry. In fact, it's a perfect symmetry. So it would also make sense to use them together to have a global movement in the whole show. So again, we can try and associate, when we find patterns, try to associate them together to understand which one is which. And hopefully, you see that on the left, Anemone has only 3 possible patterns, and arc has 4, because laser 3 can be used in 2 different manners. So if we can make a group of 3 and a group of 4, we can guess which one is which. So to do that, we look for cycles on the tape with basic pattern recognition algorithms, and we find those ones. So this is the right number, so we're on the good tracks. And then we do some cross-correlation. So what you see on the left is just big tables of numbers, but what it represents is correlation between on-off signals of all the different configurations. So for example, on the top you have correlations between signals from kinetic patterns for laser 1 and 2. So most of correlations are about 0, which means there is no particular link between the two. But sometimes you get something that what I highlighted in red is when it's above opens 1. So it's starting to be a bit bigger. So it means that when, let's say for example, laser 1 configuration 1 is used, it's likely to be used together with laser 2 configuration 12, as you can see in the top table. So again, working out the fact that there is 3 and 4 possible combinations, we can guess that it was done this way. So, okay, sorry, you know, some stuff happened on the table, so you're not supposed to. It's not supposed to be filled. So there was omega deflector unused, and now we added all the red figures. Now let's look at the remaining figures. So we can roughly place them in 3 different categories. There are some missing figures also, but most of them are there. So you see that there are some that are supposed to be played alone on the left, some that are supposed to be played together that create, with 2 lasers and create an overall shape. For example, the lotus in the middle. And finally, on the right, you have pyramid and rosas, which are meant to be played with 3 lasers. So again, applying the same technique of correlation, we can guess that, that's supposed to be filled, that we can guess which are triplets or duets or solos. So it looks like it's almost done, but we have to say, for example, well, triplet 1 is a pyramid. So now we have done all we can with the tape and the drawing, so we have to bring in other material. So what I did was look at photos because they tell us something about the show. Those photographs were long exposure photographs, most of them taken for more than 2 seconds. So what it is, it's a snapshot of the score of the show, but squeezed together. So we can try and work out. It's not a timeline, but there is some information on there. So what we can do is try to, based on what we already know, try to infer data we don't yet know. So looking at this photograph, for example, we see there are flashes. So we know exactly the flashes, which one are triggered, and we can recognize them on the photograph. So we can give the numbers. You see there is this omega button for laser 1. There is also on the left, it's a bit hard to see, but there is a deflector for laser 3. And also this figure in the corner, which is called ATTL. This one, we don't know the configuration number. But all the other we do, and we know the flashes. So if we feed all that information to a script, because you don't want to do this by hand, there are more than 33,000 frames. If you feed that to a script, you can try and look for intervals of 2 or more seconds in which you can find all those triggers. And you can also, for example, exclude figures that do not appear on laser 3. So, applying the algorithm, you find this place on the tape about 17:45 and 17:50, during which the photograph was taken. So we were able to guess that based on the flashes and the omega and deflector. So what you see then is that laser 1 goes into configuration 13, which is deflector, but it's not possible to see that on the picture because it is out of frame. And also there is this configuration 0 for laser 3, so it has to be ATTL. So applying this technique with other photographs, we finally obtain this table of correspondence between configuration number and optical devices. So, as you can see, it's almost done because there are some uncertainties about the duet figures again, but most of the data is here. Yes. So, I hope this gives you a little bit of understanding of how we were able to recreate the polytope itself. And just a quick announcement, there's going to be a representation of the polytope de Cluny at IRCAM on from 21st of June up to 7th of July in Paris, in Espace de Projection at IRCAM. So of course it's going to be adapted a bit, but it's based on the exact data that we were able to recover. And at some point we want also to do a virtualization of the polytope, so you can have the real experience in VR. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pierre, for this so well-documented speech. And we're going to take some questions now. We have like just 5 minutes for this, but please.
Thank you. That's such a clear presentation, an amazing work. And I suppose it's impressive that you've managed to decode all this, but it's also impressive the sheer amount of information that is needed for this polytope. And I wonder if you gathered any understanding of how this data was programmed in the beginning.
Yes, in the future I'd like to make a genetic analysis of the polytope, but I already have some insight on that. So basically the data was computed at, for example, mostly the flashes patterns and also the specializations, etc. They were programmed and computed at a lab with an IBM mainframe, I don't know where in Paris. Then the raw data was to be put on the 9th track tape, so it was done at another lab, and then was brought back to Cluny to make some tests. So you had this kind of triangular motion. They had to do this all the time to try and see how it rendered. So there was there were many people, engineers and coders, and also labs involved, because of course this kind of equipment was very expensive and rare to find. So yes.
Other questions? He was quite clear, actually. So if there are... yeah, thank you.
Given the possibility that people don't have the opportunity to go to Paris, to Erkam, to hear that, will there be any documentation of the polytope de Cluny, a DVD or something in the web or virtual reality to have it at home?
Yes, yes. Virtual reality, yes. As I said, I was intending to make a VR simulation. So it's not planned yet, but it's in the workings, and well, we'll keep in touch when it's done. But probably in one year or something.
In reconstructing the Cluny polytope, did you also talk to people who were there, who experienced it?
Yes, for now, 2 people. So Jacques Pervillier, who was the designer for the Tourette, for the second version of them, because the first was horrible and Xenakis really despised it. Fortunately, he was quite young at the time, so he's now still alive, and remembers quite a lot of interesting details also about, for example, the non-synchronization and the fact that sometimes the show didn't end as intended. And also Bruce Rogers, who was a student of Xenakis in Indiana University, and that was the person, together with another one, who ran the show in the cabin. So you've seen it an uncountable amount of times. But yes, I'm trying also to meet other people. Unfortunately, the main programmer for this, Robert Dupuis, died a few years ago, but he was very knowledgeable on the subject, so this is very unfortunate.
So thank you, Pierre. And now I'm calling somebody lost these sunglasses. I'm like
They were found at the table outside.
These sunglasses, they're very nice. You can even pretend they're yours. Yeah. So I'm now calling Marko Slavicek. Marko, he's a PhD student in the Technical University of Berlin. And he will give a speech with the title The Narrative of the Mycenae Polytopon.
Am I on? Do you hear me? Okay. So thank you all very much for coming here to my presentation. And also I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium. I'm very happy to be here. And needless to say, I'm having a wonderful time in Greece, as always. For those who don't know me, I'm doing a PhD research on Xenakis polytopes with a case study on Polytope de Mycène. And as many of you already know, Polytope de Mycène was the last polytope Xenakis realized. It took place in 1978 at the ancient site of Mycenae that we are going to have an opportunity to visit tomorrow. For the paper I prepared for this symposium, I did not want to focus on political background of the polytope, nor the peculiarities of its performance. Rather, I wanted to speak to you about the story or the narrative that Xenakis wishes to communicate with the audience. Of course, this narrative is related to ancient Greek history and mythology, and we are going to see in what way Xenakis structures the event. So, as a brief introduction, the Mycenaean civilization that Xenakis was so inspired by flourished in the Bronze Age Greece, specifically in 2nd millennium BCE, and it's named after this prominent site of Mycenae, but there were other centers as well, obviously. The Mycenaean language was an early form of Greek, and the alphabet they used, what we know today as linear B script, was a syllabic form of written Greek. Also, Mycenaean religion included several deities that we also find later on in the Olympic pantheon. And after the collapse of Mycenaean civilization came the so-called Greek Dark Ages, followed by Archaic period, Classical period, and so on. So we are talking here about really, really ancient history. But the very historic setting of the Mycenaean period became a source of inspiration for many Greek myths and legends. The most famous of which is probably the one about the Trojan War, as it is described in the Homer's Iliad. But there are other notorious stories, like the one about the tragic King Oedipus and the story of the curse on the house of Atreus, which is the story in which the royal Mycenaean family engages in blood revenge that takes course over the course of several generations, and ultimately this curse is being abolished by Orestes. Now, Xenakis was very fond of Mycenaean culture, and with this polytope he wanted to pay an homage to this culture, but he also wanted to reflect or contemplate our own relationship to them. And to structure the polytope, Xenakis used, or better said, reused 5 of his musical compositions that he carefully chose because of their symbolism and because in one way or the other they relate to ancient Mycenaeans. These pieces include 2 percussion pieces, Psapha and Persephassa, and 3 vocal and ensemble pieces, Oresteia, Aelen and Akolon. Now, the last 3 pieces, the vocal pieces, are based on the texts by the great 3 Athenian tragedians, which are Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides. The only music that Xenakis created for the polytope was the series of electronic sound interpolations that we know today as Mycene Alpha. But also Xenakis included narrations, the recitations in ancient Greek language, namely of the fragments found on the Mycenaean clay tablets and the excerpts taken from Homer's Iliad. Now, I'm not going to talk in too much detail about any of these pieces individually, because tomorrow at Mycenae we are going to have opportunity to discuss this in further detail. For now, I would just like to let Xenakis speak for himself and to quote an excerpt from the text of his. This text was originally published in the booklet of the program of the Polytop in 1978, and Xenakis addresses there his choice of the pieces. So he writes, "The elements of this revival are the music to Aeschylus' Oresteia, that of the songs of Sophocles' Oedipus et Colonus, and that to Euripides' Helen, uniting in this way high summits of the Mycenaeans as seen by the Athenian 5th century BCE. The texts from Homer and from linear B-script tablets, pronounced according to the phonetics of their time, the music of Persephassa for 6 percussionists, dedicated to the Chthonian deity, and that of Sappha, dedicated to Sappho, whose language Aeolic is a direct parent of Mycenaean." Now, in the same booklet, we also find the list of performances as they occurred in the Polytop. And if we take a look, we can notice that Xenakis is altering the music performances, the narrations in ancient Greek, and electronic sound interpolations. The Polytop ends with a performance of Oresteia trilogy, which historically takes place after the Trojan War, and it describes the end of the old curse. And the music pieces that Xenakis uses, together with narrations, together they describe the events that we already mentioned, which is Trojan War, the King Oedipus at Colonus, and the curse on the house of Atreus. So we have this whole spectrum of stories. We also have the element of religious worship, and we have the element of language. It is interesting to notice that Xenakis included in the Polytop all 3 great literary genres of ancient Greece, which is epic in Homer's Iliad, lyric in the poetry of Sappho, and of course drama in Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Now, I would like us to take a look at one little diagram to see how Xenakis deploys various elements throughout the Polytop. We can identify 24 segments. The electronic sound interpolations are spaced out more or less evenly, like this, throughout the Polytop. The narrations in Mycenaean language occur 3 times. Once at the beginning, once somewhere in the middle, and in the end. The Homer's Iliad is also spaced similarly to electronic sound interpolations. Then the percussion piece Sappha was a single event, a single performance, just like the percussion piece Persephassa. But Euripides' Helen, Xenakis actually divided into 3 parts and separated them in the Polytop. Then Oedipus at Colonus was another single event, and of course Oresteia, the trilogy, takes place at the end, and the 3 parts occur one after the other. Now, in my paper, I refer to cybernetic art and scientific studies that influenced Xenakis' thinking basically from the very beginning of his career. And some important features of so-called cybernetic narrative include fragmentation, non-linearity, and circularity. I think regarding fragmentation, it is more or less clear what Xenakis is doing here. He's taken the fragments of his music, deploys them throughout the timeline, but he also takes the fragments of ancient history, of Mycenaean history, because he's not telling the whole story. Rather, he's picking up key events that he finds of great importance to represent in the Polytop. Non-linearity is also present because, first of all, we have several stories happening at the same time, but also at times Xenakis likes to shift the plot a little bit back and forth. But apart from that, there is a strong sense of linearity actually in the polytope. He's telling the story from beginning to the end chronologically. So we can say that fragmentation definitely is present. Non-linearity is present, but together with linearity, so yes and no. And now regarding the notion of circularity, this is a tricky one because in cybernetics, circularity is related to the concept of feedback, because a cybernetic system is a self-regulating or self-correcting system for which one needs the feedback. Now, this is not what we necessarily find in this case in Xenakis, but I would argue that we can find circularity symbolically represented. If we take a look at Mycenaean narrations, the first one that occurs at the beginning of the polytope and the one with which the polytope ends is actually the same segment, the same fragment of text from the same clay tablet that Xenakis is using. So he just copy-pastes the same text in the beginning and the end. In this way, we can argue that he completes the circular arc. But there is something else to add to this. If we isolated the electronic sound interpolations, so all instances of electronic music in the performance, we can see this pattern. Then if we isolate the narrations, the spoken word, so both Mycenaean narrations as well as Iliad by Homer, we find this pattern. In the end, when we collect all the music performances, this pattern. So we can notice a model here that repeats itself. It begins with electronic music, followed by spoken word narrations, and ending with music performance. Then it goes again, electronics, narration, music. Electronics, narration, music. Electronics, narration, music. And now we reach the axis of this symmetry of the structure, and we go backwards. Music, narration, electronics. Music, narration, electronics. Music, narration, electronics. Music, narration, and blank. It seems we are missing here the final electronic segment. So, could it be possible that the first electronic segment is actually also the last one, and that we could think of this narrative as a self-repeating one that can go on indefinitely? Now, to understand this question, I must say that this diagram is based on the program booklet, on the list of the performances as they were printed in the booklet. But the archives of Xime, the research center in Athens, they have the original recordings of the polytope, recorded of the performances and of the general rehearsal in 1978. And I had an opportunity to listen to them. And when I played the ending of the polytope, I didn't find any Mycenaean narration there. I also didn't find the electronic intermission. Basically, the show ends with Oresteia, the performance of Oresteia. And in the end of the performance, from the citadel, the children are coming down in a procession, going down the road and towards the valley where the audience was located. And then they intermingle with the audience, everybody is singing and playing, and the audience is clapping. So the whole event ends with in a full volume, in some kind of glorious finale. But in the recording, if we go backwards just a little bit, approximately 2 minutes, we will find that in the score of Oresteia, the third part, namely in the bar 305, So at the 3:05 of the performance, the music stops, the performance stops, and this is where Xenakis places the last Mycenaean narration. And then, after it is said, from the bar 3:06 onwards, the music resumes again, and thus the polytop ends with actually the finale of Oresteia, just last 2 minutes. So we could argue that there is actually a segment following the narration, only this segment is not an electronic one, but it is a live performance. So what is Xenakis trying to tell us here? Because we obviously noticed that there is a form of symmetry in the narrative, and there is this copy-paste of narration number 1 and the last one. So maybe we could interpret this as traveling back in time. The introduction to the polytop is electronic music, so in a way we are traveling from the modern age of technology towards the Mycenaean period, and we end in this ecstatic, ritualistic performance, some kind of primordial element. Xenakis gave an interview during the realization of this polytop in '78, in which he said that art has only one way. Whatever existed in the past also exists in the present and exists and will exist in the future. So I think we can conclude that he was indeed thinking in terms of symmetry and circularity, and I believe we can apply this not just to his general. Now, what I did for this symposium, but I would like to discuss with you nevertheless, is not the reading of the structure, rather through the lens of Xenakis' own theories, stochastic theories. Text from the book Formalized Music. The first quote is from the preface, where Xenakis writes, "All music is automatically homogenized and unified. Everything is everywhere is the word of this book and its table of coherences. Heraclitus would say that the ways up and down are one." Xenakis is referring here to pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus. We have some fragments preserved from his writings, and the fragment number 60 is this sentence, "The way up and down is one and the same." So Heraclitus is using this riddle to interpret or to describe his vision of the universe, or how he sees the underlying principles of the universe and nature. And Xenakis is using this riddle as a metaphor for his own concept of microcomposition and macrocomposition. Now, to explain what I mean by that, I would like to quote one other thing, one other part of Formalized Music, this time from the chapter number 11 on sieves. Xenakis writes, "In music, the question of symmetries and periodicities plays a fundamental role at all levels, from a sample in sound synthesis by computers to the architecture of a piece." So we see that Xenakis is obviously approaching musical composition in a holistic way. He wishes to apply the similar stochastic principles in microsound as well as the musical form. But my question is, if we could go one step further and go to one level up, and instead of musical form of the piece, think about the form of the collection of musical pieces which this polytop is. If we could apply some similar stochastic thinking in the organization of the polytop. Now, there is another quote from the same chapter on sieves. It goes, "Everything that will be said here could be applied to any set of characteristics of sound, or of well-ordered sound structures, and especially to any group which entails an additive operation and whose elements are multiples of unity. That is to say that they belong to the set of natural numbers, for example, pitches, time points, loudnesses, densities, degrees of order, local timbres, etc. Again, my question is, could we add something else to this list of music parameters, possibly the structure of the polytope? And here's another quote from the same chapter. Every well-ordered set can be represented as points in a line, as long as a reference point is given for the origin and the length for the unit distance, and this is a sieve. Now, I'm not arguing that Xenakis was necessarily thinking about sieves when he was structuring the polytope. He likely wasn't, but we do know certain things. We do know that he was influenced by information theory and cybernetics, and we do know that he was trying to implement stochastics wherever he could, from microsound structure to the macro form. And I personally find the sieve theory quite intuitive for understanding of the structure of the polytope. And to visualize what I mean by this, I would like to show you a sketch that Xenakis created for his percussion piece Persephassa. It is a piece that was included in the polytope and it was composed only 3 years before the creation of polytope. For this piece, Xenakis uses the rhythmical sieves. So the sieve technique is present in the microstructure organization of rhythm. Theoretically, an individual piece can also have applied sieves in the macro form. But could we theoretically find a similar way of thinking in the diagram that we have just seen? Because in both cases, Xenakis superimposes different distributions of events in time. At the end of the chapter on sieves, Xenakis writes, "In provisional conclusion, it will be said that sieve theory is the study of the internal symmetries of a series of points either constructed intuitively, given by observation, or invented completely from moduli of repetition." So I would like to end this presentation not as a statement, but rather as a question. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Marco, for this amazing speech and for all these questions. Now, if we possibly have some questions, yes, Nikos.
Thanks very much, Marco. Regarding the documentation and what we said about the schedule, the form that you see in the program in comparison with what Xime has, are there in Xime full recordings of all 4 performances?
Xime actually has the recordings that I received are several of them, so it is several performances.
Because there were 4, therefore.
Yes, as far as I know, there are 3 performances in the general rehearsal. So what Xime has are not the full recordings, but they are big chunks of it. So we have several big chunks. It wasn't a single tape that covered the whole event. The whole event lasted an hour and a half.
Right.
I think the longest one that we have is approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. It lacks the beginning, but there is one recording that is the full performance. So when I was talking about the possible missing segment in the end, there isn't a recording that there is something cut. There is actually applause by the audience, and really there are the several instances of the endings of the performances, yes.
No, because what you mentioned about finishing with the Oresteia,
yes.
I think it fits to what he says in a documentary that was shot during the rehearsals. He mentions that he ends with the parade and the Oresteia finale, so probably it fits. Anyway, what's printed in the program doesn't seem for me a safe guide of what actually happened, because the program is made earlier.
There is also there are 2 papers of Xenakis sketches that he created for this performance, the diagram, where he deploys not only the music and narrations and electronics, but also the light effects and the procession. So he has the whole thing structured. I was here talking about only the performances. I didn't include the light show and everything, but we could also analyze this as some kind of different added structure to it. Everything is superimposed there.
Yeah.
So I was comparing these diagrams that are handwritten by Xenakis, the printed booklet from the program, and compared it to the recordings that we have.
Yeah.
And the recordings that we have, all instances of it, they always display the same order. Like the pieces in between, they're not alternating. So
Right.
the order that I managed to reconstruct from all these instances,
it's fixed.
It's fixed, yes.
And the last thing about that, correct me if I'm wrong, I remember that in the documentary they're also rehearsing Polata Dina by Antigone. Am I mistaken? Wasn't this played also? It's not mentioned in the program.
It wasn't in the performance.
It wasn't.
It wasn't.
So they're rehearsing it, or I remember.
Yes, maybe there was an idea of including. I don't know about that. I'll have to check it. But there isn't in the performance, and there isn't also in the diagram that Xenakis wrote.
No.
So I don't know what they were doing. I will have to check on that.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for that really brilliant exposition. Just a little thing. At the beginning you said that the very first upik, the opening gesture, if you like, of this narrative is a moment of the modern.
Yes.
And, well, you know that I'm not myself very clear that the upik is, despite its computerized presence, a modern material, shall we say. So, I mean, I just maybe wonder if that's a necessary part of your structure.
I wouldn't call it necessary. It was just one of the possible interpretations. But yes, I think the upik sounds that Xenakis includes in the polytope are there for a reason. It is not something to represent the time in which we live. It is reflecting the Mycenaean chaotic history. And for these interpolations that Xenakis created for the polytope, also all pieced together in the end as a single unified piece, Mycen Alpha, Xenakis was trying to structure two different sound materials in a way. It is what he calls the clouds of sound. We can compare them to the clusters, and arborescences, these branching tree-like shapes. So out of, I believe, 10 pages of upik that he created, 2 of them are those branchy arborescences, the others are clusters. And also formally we can find similar notions of that in the polytope, because we find clusters, of course, apart from Xenakis' music that obviously uses sound clouds and these big sound masses. He also uses in the processions of performers. They form a cluster of people. Then also there was the procession of animals, of goats and sheep that were carrying little lights between the horns and bells around the necks. So they, in the nighttime performance, they also form a cloud. So he was also reflecting what was going on in the polytope in the music of upik. But regarding arborescences, the tree-like shapes, again, glissandi, they're famous Xenakis material, and when we listen to these 2 fragments of upik where he displays such arborescences, we have these complex lines of glissandi, which we could also compare to the complexity of different narratives, different stories or plot lines that occur at the same time and intermingle with each other. So I think there was something deeper to it. He wanted to visually and audibly express what he was doing with the whole polytope. So in a way, the element of electronics is what is modern, but the material itself is, of course, very suiting for the whole event.
You talked about narrations in a Mycenaean language.
Sorry?
You talked about narrations
Yes.
in Mycenaean language.
Yes.
And I saw there was linear B.
Yes.
And I would like to know if there are also syllabic Chypriot writings, because in the archives with Maki we found a book in his personal library by Ernst Doppelhofer, and in this book there were a letter with a text in syllabic Chypriot writing that was just not translated, but translated just by pronouncing, but it is not possible to translate it at the time because I asked to archaeological department at the UCL, and I would like to know if it could be one of the texts that was pronounced in Mycenaean Polytop. Is it possible? What is the writing used for these texts?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think it represents a lot in the Polytop. When those Mycenaean tablets were first discovered, this linear B script, the hieroglyphics, we didn't know how to read them originally. I think it was maybe late 19th, early 20th century when they were excavated. But it was later, actually around the 50s or maybe 60s, then that some archaeologists or linguists took a closer look at it, and they realized they actually represent the syllables of ancient Greek, so they're not individual letters but rather syllabic forms. And they went through it and they managed to reconstruct a lot. They managed to figure out what individual words or syllables form, and they managed to connect it and prove that Mycenaean language was indeed early form of Greek. And they released it in a book, I think in 1971, that is called Documents in Mycenaean Language or something like that. And as far as I know, Xenakis was aware of this book because this was the only publication of the list of all fragments that we have from these clay tablets with the possible translations and the commentaries. Now, of course, the question is how faithfully can we reconstruct the actual pronunciation? And for the Polytop, Xenakis was consulting linguists, and he was trying to be as precise as possible. For the things that it was impossible to reconstruct, he would, I guess, apply his own intuition. But he was very specific about how these fragments should be pronounced. Now, it is also something important to say that when I said that the first narration in Mycenaean language and the last one are the same, I kind of lied, because there is one little trick about it. It is the same text, it is taken from the same tablet, and it reads that it's basically a description of a procession in the honor of the god Zeus. So the procession is starting, the people are carrying the offerings. This is just one piece of sentence or a fragment of sentence that Xenakis included in the program booklet. It was printed with the linear B letters, and the translation, the pronunciation of syllables, translation to transliteration to Greek alphabet and the translation to English, actually. So Xenakis, together with what he finds in the book, he adjusts this translation a little bit, but basically the text reads that the procession starts in honor of god Zeus. Now, this very same text occurs in the end, but instead of Zeus, Xenakis puts the name Poseidon, so he changes the god. So this is the little difference that happens. And I was thinking, why would he do that? And obviously there are various possible reasons. But if you remember the diagram that I showed, the midpoint of the polytop, the axis of the symmetry that we found, that is the point that occurs when the music plays Persephassa. And Persephassa is a piece dedicated to the goddess Persephone, who was the queen of the underworld and the wife of Hades. Now, as you may know, the original rulers of the universe, of the world, was the generation of Titan gods, and they were overthrown by the new generation of Olympians. And three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, the sons of Uranus, when they came to power, they divided the world between themselves. Zeus was ruling the sky, Poseidon was ruling the sea, and Hades was ruling the underworld. So, with the presence of Persephone in the polytope, we can say that Xenakis includes all three elements of ancient mythological world to complete the circle, the cycle. And there are other things that I could say about these Mycenaean narrations, but I think for the understanding of the structure it is not necessary to go into much detail. But yes, it is partially possible to reconstruct, but there is actually a translation that Xenakis offers in the booklet.
Okay, just a quick last question because we don't have, there's no time left. Would you like, Ms. Logothetis?
The question is about improvisation. Is there any, do you know something about Xenakis' point towards improvisation? Because for me, I think that the end, which is, you said is not totally performed, has not been totally performed. Could it have been that there has been an improvisational aspect on that event to open up to the auditory, to bring the Mycenaean tradition into the present now?
Well, according to the testimonies, yes, there were some elements that were changing. What didn't change, based on what I found in the recordings and the documentation, is the order of events. Now, what we do know is that after the first performance, Xenakis also included video projections of the various pictures of representing some ancient Greek-related visuals. After the first performance, allegedly, Xenakis abolished that. He didn't use it for the other performances. We don't know why, maybe he wasn't happy with how it looked like. There is another thing that Professor Marina Kotzamani told me, that when Xenakis was directing the polytope, using a walkie-talkie from the console, that he would say to Olha Tunaki, who was narrating the Mycenaean fragments in Iliad, that he would tell her that the pitch that she's using for recitation, that she should go one step up, like half a tone up or something like that. So I think there was still a lot of room for improvisation regarding the arrangement or the performance itself, but as far as I found, the structure remained the same, it remained strict.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation, but it's very important also to speak about the landscape, because it's the most important thing, and the acoustics, the archaeoacoustics of the landscape. So this is a very good presentation, but we don't know exactly how the duration of its performance, because okay, we have the fixed electroacoustic composition, but the other, maybe in the future it would be very nice to see which is the series of narration, electroacoustic music and performance and music. And the other is that maybe in the future it's very well, we must present the different places, the levels where the polytopon has taken place, because with the walkie-talkie and communicating in order to contact all the different places. This is the very interesting thing of the polytop, and the other is connecting people in the same space, but also connecting people of the area, because he has brought the children, so he wanted to create a social event, and this is very important. He didn't want to be someone who makes a fiesta just for himself to show in a nationalistic way that he's through ancient Greek, but to show the importance of Mykenes. So he brought all the people from the area to participate. So the other events, the goats, the children that sing, etc., is one of the most important elements of this polytop, or not only the music. So I think also the polytopon here, and there's no answer, it's also a bridge between Horos and Chronos. What's the most important? That the landscape is the most important. I think in the future we must investigate these acoustics and the different places. Xenakis very wisely has put the musician here, there, and there, in different places. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I agree with everything you said. Landscape, the spatial disposition, and other elements such as light show and performance itself played an important role. The reason why I didn't speak about this is simply because this paper focuses simply on the story or the narrative. But obviously there are other elements to include in the analysis. Regarding what might be the most important element of the polytop, just briefly, then we can finish. In the same interview that I quoted from Xenakis in 1978 that he was given when he was doing the polytop, he actually said that he finds the most important element is the language. And he's using 4 languages. This is ancient Mycenaean, Homeric Greek, Classical Greek, and Modern Greek. And he wanted to show in what way we are connected to our ancestors linguistically. We can also consider the language of Yupik, the electronic sounds, to be a form of language or some form of communication. Either way, this is what Xenakis stated, that he finds language the most important element, but of course everything plays a significant part of it.
Thank you, Marco. I'm very quickly asking Anastasia Hintoglu, PhD candidate at the Department of Theatre Studies of the University of the Peloponnese, to join the panel. Anastasia is giving a speech with the title Xenakis' Oresteia, a Reconstructed Theatre.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm really glad to talk right after Mr. Slavicek, since I will talk about the Xenakis work in which he just referred. So, with this presentation, I aim to demonstrate the theatrical side of Xenakis' Oresteia, a musical work based on the dramatic text of the Aeschylus, originally written as incidental music for a theatrical production of stage director Alex Solomos' entire trilogy. Xenakis transformed it after its premiere in 1966 in Ypsilanti at Michigan into a standalone work that retains many elements of its original form. Xenakis is a composer who has often approached music in relation to other arts or sciences, always carrying out deep philosophical and scientific research before writing a musical work. Therefore, for the composition of Oresteia, the composer approached the Aeschylus work by conducting an in-depth study of the text, the characteristics and essence of tragedy, ancient Greek music, and other extra-European cultures. In this work, the theatre hides itself in an unobstructed way, but emerges throughout the music, being present in each note in a more intimate way, as a dramatic text, as stage actions, or even as theatricality in the music itself, the essence and logic of the theatre remaining in this musical work in an abstract, though concrete way. In order to define the result of this special aesthetic and practical collaboration of these two genres, we cannot simply use the term opera, as it is marked several times, or musical theatre, but prefer to opt for another term, that of theatralized music, which we will analyze further below. Please give me 1 second in order to put the visual. So, Yannis Xenakis' collaboration with Alexis Solomos, one of the most important, prolific and innovative stage directors of post-war Greece, began in 1964 with the production of Soupiats at the theatre of Epidaure. At the time, Xenakis was a political refugee in France for his militant involvement. Thus, the opportunity to write music for an Aeschylus work performed in Epidaure was a way to get closer to his native country and its traditions, and to experiment in an artistic genre he had never before encountered. Solomos was the ideal collaborator for this project, as he was carrying out an in-depth research into the substance of tragedy and its original characteristics, and his ambition was to overturn the conventional and academic approaches to staging that prevailed at the time, which he still considered to be cliché and not at all in keeping with the ancient spirit. Studying the correspondence of the two men, we see that it was therefore within a framework of profound research into Greek tragedy that they sought the most suitable chant and wanted to integrate music into the theatrical action, not to write music that had no apparent connection with the stage, but music that satisfied the needs of tragedy. He refers to this in his text Notice on the Orestia by saying that tonal or Syrian music was incapable of expressing the sonic sensibility of tragedy, and that other functions had to be found in order to achieve this, based more on the functions of tragedy itself. The two artists agreed on the musical function that would be practiced in their creation, functions that at the same time wanted to come closer to antiquity, namely the catalogie, a technique used in the Byzantine music, the instrument of worship played by the choir to enrich its end aspect, and the spatiality of sound, the sound commentary where the music itself expresses a dramatic situation and the symbol of events, among others. Already in the theatrical production of the work, we can underline that theatre and music were in a situation of complementarity. Furthermore, we can underline the importance of music in Ypsilanti's production by taking into account that Xenakis wrote music for almost the entire duration of the performance, meaning 110 minutes, of which the choral parts were strictly sung and the rest was accompanying music that was reasonable, measured, in a way symbolic, in order to respect the spirit of the Aeschylus contemporaries. On the other hand, although the performance in the United States was in English, Xenakis initially wrote his music in ancient Greek. This shows Xenakis' attachment to the ancient Greek language, which carries a tradition of tragedy within itself, as a very well-preserved monument that offers us a deep insight into the spirit of the time. Moreover, we assume that from the very beginning of the writing process, the composer intended to have this score performed as an autonomous work. So, what remains of the creation of Ypsilanti is a musical work of Xenakis as we know it today. We can therefore already state that the existence of this work is due to a perfectly theatrical process. The exchange between composer and director considerably enriched the composer's idea about the theatre, and we shall see that several theatrical elements remained in the score of the concert version as an inherent part, even outside the stage context. Orestia, in its original form, in its original concert version, was 36 minutes long. Its first performance took place at the Sigma Festival in Bordeaux on 14th of November in 1967, 1 year after the production of Ypsilanti. It is a work for 12 musicians, a children's choir, 20 children, and 2 choirs, 18 women and 18 men, equipped with some musical accessories. Xenakis thus created an autonomous musical work with a few stage innovations, transforming each part of the Aeschylus trilogy into a piece of music. Originally, the work was divided into 3 parts: Agamemnon, Coiphor, and Eumenide. In 1987, Xenakis added to the score of Agamemnon the part of Cassandra for baritone and percussionist after a commission for the performance of the Orestia staged by Yannis Kokos among the ruins of the city of Gibellina in Sicily. In 1992, the composer added the part of the goddess Athena for baritone soloist and instrumental ensemble to the third part of the Orestia for the performance at the Megaron Musikis in Greece in Athens, bringing the work to a definitive end. This autonomous work was composed of choral parts at certain key moments of the dramatic action. The narrative of the drama now existed in the score, expressed purely throughout the music. The text, even its absence, remains important as it is the basis for all the music and thus continues to carry the meaning and guide the development of the drama. Xenakis keeps a text that was set to music for the theatrical performance, though the dominant presence of almost all the protagonists no longer exists, finding only the chorus as the main character of the work, as well Orestes and Electra, played by 3 men and 3 women respectively from each chorus. Some key roles in the work, such as Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, are mentioned, but their presence is only expressed throughout music. Solomos asked Xenakis to focus his music on the chorus, as it was the chorus that expressed, that sang the Greek tragedy, meanwhile being the representative of the audience, meaning the people, the society. So by using it as a protagonist, it creates a notion of communion with the audience. The added parts of Cassandra and the goddess Athena are not main roles, but represents the 2 fundamental notions of the tragedy. Cassandra represents barbarism, fatalism, and vengeance, and on the other hand, Athena represents logic, justice, and democracy. The 2 additional parts enriched the work's dramaturgical aspect, and we can now see that Xenakis' reading of the tragedy is very legitimate, given that the main notion of Aeschylus' tragedy is the victory of justice throughout democracy against the law of vengeance. Throughout Orestia, the composer wanted to convey the Aeschylus drama in its entirety, its text and its main notion, as well as the spirit of the tragedy, which is defined as total spectacle according to Xenakis' idea, meaning it is a synthesis of the major arts that includes text, myth, music, theatrical performance, and all of these elements must interpenetrate each other. In his score, Xenakis indicates certain stage directions, namely the position and some movements of the choir in space. We find phrases in the score that indicate where is the beginning of each section in relation to the drama, even when the text is not included. Consequently, we can easily deduce that this musical work by Xenakis has kept its theatrical character for which it was originally written, as shown by its 6th scenic note, which states that a sober and austere action could be implemented. In this way, there is freedom in the performance of this work to create scenic actions. Indeed, Orestia is not just a musical work, nor even a simply theatrical work. It is an autonomous work that could not legitimately be characterized in a way that is already known. The theater exists within this work in a delicate way, unburdened by common cliché and codes. The music derives from the theater and vice versa, mixing these 2 genres in an even tighter way. In any case, it is remarkable that Xenakis did not like theater. And we claim that is why he appropriated this genre, adapting it to his own style, created something unique. It is exactly this indefinable aspect that led us to search for a relevant definition to characterize this work, concluding that the term theatralized music would be the most appropriate to define it. Theatralized music in the sense that the music becomes a stage to express the drama. The dramatic text becomes music, and the sound, in its absurdity, takes shape to express the dramatic situation. The musicians and choristers, for their part, not only have a sonic role, but at the same time they have a scenic role by interpreting in a more or less abstract way the characters. Moreover, in order for the scenic reality to be evident, there is little room for the passive spectator, but must immerse himself in this new approach to drama, accepting the redefinition of the stage space and the spectator space, which now exists on an equal footing in order to feel the event as an experience that unites both worlds. I will now proceed to some brief examples in order to demonstrate the essence of the theatralized music of the Orestia. So the work begins with the instruments playing for a few bars and the chorus of the elders of Argos entering the stage shortly afterwards, singing in ancient Greek about Agamemnon's return to Mycenae. The chorus, not being from the very beginning of the stage, asserts from the outset its dramatic role. The choir and the Coripheos sings in katalogi, which is a prose reading without intonation, in recto tono, with isochronous syllables, which comes to us from the Byzantine period, a detached, non-subjective reading of the text. Solomon wanted to create the illusion of a prayer for a ritual atmosphere, and Xenakis proposed this technique, which according to him could be a link with ancient Greek tragedy. Let's listen to a brief excerpt. Xenakis uses music as a carrier of the story, representing the tragic text in some parts of the work all throughout sound. A good example of this is to be found in bars 59 to 95, where even in the complete absence of stage action and text, the music incarnates a chorus text about the sacrifice of Eugenia, the young girl being embodied by a solo oboe, playing an extrovert descending melody before being joined by the other lower instruments. We shall remark, moreover, the verse mentioned in the beginning of each section that corresponds to Aeschylus' text. You can see it, ST 228, ST 237. That exists in the whole in the whole score of Xenakis. In the entrance of Cassandra, he uses a recurring motif on the bongos that creates a sense of expectation and imminent danger, while establishing a rather primitive atmosphere in keeping with Aeschylus' idea of her as a barbarian. The baritone has to play both the role of the chorus and that of Cassandra throughout various changes in his voice, singing low notes for the chorus in a high range using the falsetto technique for Cassandra. Okay, we cannot listen to this extra, so I'm really sorry. There is a man who plays a woman, and that's perfectly consistent with what was done in antiquity, where all the roles were played by men. Moreover, the heterophony is reminiscent of elements of no theatre. In general, Xenakis believes that traces of ancient tragedy can no longer be found in Western civilization, and it is in other extra-European cultures that one must seek its essence. Additionally, Xenakis notes that the interpretation of the interpretation must avoid any expression of sentiment, for there is a great danger of superimposing current cliché on Aeschylus' text. One might think that the suggestion takes away the theatricality of the work, but one must also take into consideration that today's theatre is not only a theatre of feelings or a psychological one, but a theatre of situation where it is this situation that creates the emotion. The interpretation of Cassandra requires a high degree of physical application for both performers, and therefore the theatrical dimension, or even the creation of drama, must be done all throughout the musical interpretation. Immediately after the killing of Agamemnon, the old men of Argos mourned their dead king. Solomos asked Xenakis to write expressive music for this passage in order to better support the drama and thus touch the audience that would create a feeling not too alien to them. The text is set to music with careful respect for the prosody, the time signatures and the score are strongly linked to the text and involved in accordance with it. The text sung almost in unison by the male choir in microtonal writing, creating a ceremonial atmosphere from the outset, which refers at first to the Greek Orthodox Church, which is amplified by the choice of orchestrating the voices with two instruments playing in octaves. The choir sings interrupted by a violent chord played by the orchestra, a chord that is repeated each time in the same way, like a fixed sound object. We might even say a Dorian column. Leaves the stage, descends among the audience and forms two semicircles behind it, making way for the women's chorus, which arrives at the same time in a slow and imposing procession, all those taking place like a ritual. In the choiphor, the audience is included in the recognition dialogue between Orestes and Electra, both performed by groups of choristers, where the stichometia takes place with the audience in the middle. The two roles are thus no longer individual. Xenakis gives them a collective character, thus amplifying the symbolic aspect of the works, since for him it is not a performance centered around character, but above all around symbols. According to Spiros Sakas, Xenakis liked this passage very much because the frontal relationship between the stage and the audience was broken, thus integrating the spectators into the performance itself in a situation of communion. During the last part of the Orestia, the Erinyes are transformed into human Eden. A choir of children enters the stage and slowly groups in the middle of the stage, symbolizing this transformation. After the part of Cadis Athena and the institution of democracy, the men's choir also comes in stage before starting a jubilant collective singing. 200 small metal flag leaves are to be distributed to the audience at the end of the work, so that they shake them in joy, thus uniting with the spirit of the choir, becoming part of the performance by their contribution to the jubilation of the victory of democracy, amplifying the notion of communion between performance and spectator in a relationship of equality, passing the democratic spirit that runs throughout the work and the thinking of Xenakis. The composer used an element of Hessian drama that is not technical, but rather refers to the relationship between the theatre and the people, which is the basis of all forms of theatricality. With his own means, he tries to reconstruct the relationship on other terms in the circumstances of today's society with the aim of strengthening the link between the two parties. Furthermore, this work can be used by musicians to enrich their practice with theatre. It can also help the theatre to unite with musical sound and its concerns. Xenakis' sixth stage note, namely that an action can be implemented, gives the freedom to choose the aesthetics and the means necessary for the desired representation of the work, whether with actors, dancers, projections, or lights. What has not yet been taken into account, however, is that it's not only the sixth performance note that makes this piece potentially theatrical, but that Xenakis' other notes can also serve as a basis for a stage result. This music, which is already theatrical in itself, can support the drama without the need for an explanation of the story. In our opinion, an overly theatrical and descriptive approach diminishes the inherent theatricality of the music itself. We strongly believe that this work offers the opportunity to bring out the notion of theatralized music, that is, music that highlights the theatricality that emerges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anastasia, for this detailed presentation of the Oresteia. Are there any questions? Yes, Ms. Logothetis.
There has been recently found an old papyrus, and it's located now at the National Library in Vienna, from Euripides text with a notation. Do you know about that?
Of Euripides text?
Euripides. Old text, but with music, which was a very recent.
You mean Aeschylus or Euripides?
Euripides. Yes, a fragment. A fragment.
So I'm sorry, I will. I don't know.
About that.
I don't know about it, but I will.
No, it's very
I will search it. I will
it's
look
very
about
interesting because they recorded it, and there is a score and registration of that, and I noticed. Because of the last big opera of my father, which is Aus welchem Material ist der Stein von Sisyphus, which was never performed as a whole, that the electronic part of my father's music has the same rhythm, and now I hear about the Doric rhythm of Xenakis.
I see.
And I just heard that in that old original thing.
You know, as I said, it's a technique that exists since Byzantine music as we know it. So the Byzantine period is relative to the ancient Greek period.
Yeah,
so probably it is a technique that passes from the antiquity, really before Jesus Christ, and thus continues the tradition inside the traditions that passes.
Yeah, but it's not consciously done. I mean, I know it from my father. That was not conscious. It was not there yet.
I see what you're saying.
Is it known in Greece that this is an old tradition? Is it known that theater originally was only sang and not spoken?
That's a question to be thinking about. No, because there's a chorus part that is mostly singing, as they said about the Greek tragedy. The part that
like the main roles, not the chorus, the characters, they were talking in I think that they had the prosody of the language. They had, that had some kind of musicality in it.
This is a big discussion, I believe, and as we are taking time from the most important part of the symposium, lunch, let's are there any other questions? No, so let's go on, because I mean we need to eat. Everybody needs to eat. Thank you so much.
Excuse me, before you leave, I wanted to make an announcement. Those of you who are participating in the Xenakis workshop tomorrow, which is happening at Fugaro, the bus departs. I want to remind you that there will be a bus going to Fugaro, which is, it's about 2 kilometers from the city center here. So there is a bus departing outside Elena Hotel at 9. Okay, so if you want to use the bus, you have to be there tomorrow. Thank you.